Before I begin, there's something you have to understand about the woods. I'm talking about the deep backcountry, 50 plus miles out from any station or sign of a civilization. After a certain point, everything begins to blend. The longer you spend out there, the smaller and smaller you become, until you're just another part of the environment, a movement through the valleys and peaks. It's depersonalizing, ego-killing. You forget things about yourself, and instincts guide you. It becomes natural, but it also makes you look like a lunatic. That's why we never spend more than 8 days alone in the backcountry at a time. That said, my first few months in the job were everything that I wanted. Plenty of time outdoors, mostly upkeep on trails in the backcountry, along with checking up on some old stands the Forest Service had acquired in the 50s. The pine beetle epidemic was especially bad in my region this year, so I spent a lot of time marking the mortality rates in the area, amongst other details. For the most part, I love my job. I'm a bit of an introvert, so time alone outdoors working is perfect for me. But there have been a few moments that still make me uncomfortable to think about. A couple weeks after I started, I woke up early and I drove down a pretty rough, forested section of the backcountry with lots of elevation. I was trying to check on a site that some backpackers, who had just returned from a week-long trek, had reported seeing bonfires in a few nights ago. They said the fires seemed a few hundred yards off the trail, and yet there looked like people around the flames. An aerial team couldn't find any signs of fires like the backpackers were describing, so they assumed it was falsely reported. Even so, we had a serious burn ban in effect, and I was sent out to double check and make sure. I was about 20 miles in before I found the section of the trail I needed to go down covered in earth, destroyed in some sort of landslide. It must have been recent. Neither the backpackers or the aerial team noticed it, and someone would have. I definitely couldn't drive through, but I was only about 2 miles from the site, so I grabbed my pack, checked my water, and I radioed the forest station from ATV, and let them know that I was hiking the rest of the way in. I probably should have waited for a crew to come out and clear the road, but we were all really concerned about a fire, and I won't lie, I was upset at the thought of backpackers being so careless. You could have missed the signs coming into the forest warning about forest fires and announcing the burn ban. There was no reason to be reckless, and so I hiked out there. It was only about 10:30 in the morning when I set out. I expected it to take about 2 hours to get to the area where the fires were reported. The elevation increase was drastic, so I had to pause every so often to catch my breath. After hiking for a while, I paused for a moment and realized that I wasn't on the trail anymore. This isn't that unusual. If you've ever backpacked or even gone on long hikes before, you know that it's easier than you think to stumble off the trail, even for someone experienced. I'm one of the newest and youngest rangers, but I've spent a lot of time outdoors backpacking and hiking, and normally have a great sense of direction. So I wasn't too alarmed not to know exactly where I was. You get used to being lost. The thing that alarmed me was noticing a pink hue lighting up the forest. The sun was about to disappear behind the tree line that covered the mountain to the west. I didn't think that I had been hiking that long. I had gone maybe 1.5 miles in an hour or so, I thought. But nonetheless, it appeared to be almost 7 p.m. now. I quickly decided the safest thing would be to head back south towards my ATV, which stored all of my overnight gear, and come back tomorrow. It would be embarrassing to explain to the other rangers that I had lost track of time, but it would be worse to get stuck out here all night. Without the right equipment, I might freeze to death. Besides, they would start wondering why I hadn't checked back in after so long. I grabbed some loose stones off the ground and I left a sign to indicate that I had been here, and I set off in the direction that I thought I wandered off the trail from. I quickly found it. but it was a section that I hadn't been through earlier. Somehow, I had found my way farther north. And funnily enough, I saw a yellow trail marker not far up the mountain. I realized it was the marker for the next 10-mile section, in the area that the fire reports had mentioned. The sun was almost touching the mountains now, but I decided to hike up to the marker at least, stay for a few minutes and then quickly head back before it got completely dark. I realized this wasn't ideal, but at the time it seemed better than going back with nothing to report. I hiked the few dozen yards to the marker, and I looked out over the valley to the east. It seemed empty, nothing unusual. I took a sip from my water bottle and I waited another 5 minutes. I still didn't see anything, so I decided to head out. I hadn't gone a mile before I smelled smoke coming down the mountain. I looked around, but I couldn't see any smoke columns. It was kind of unsettling. The sunset was so red everywhere that I looked. It seemed to glow surreally. Getting worried, I stumbled the last mile back and I immediately called it in. The night was darker now, and without any trace of fire in the valley. Despite smelling the smoke from earlier, I decided to spend the night on the trail in case whatever caused it caught up again. I set up a temporary camp with a one-man tent and I waited the night out. Nights in the backcountry are different than camping in other places. In the back of your head, you recognize that you are completely alone for dozens of miles. You end up listening to the night differently. Everything you hear suddenly becomes important, because now you're just another part of the forest, vulnerable. At some point, I woke up from a dream that I can't remember now, but I recall feeling unsettled. I poked my head out of the tent and crawled out to take a leak and look around for a minute. I didn't see anything, but it's hard to explain exactly how I felt. It was almost like I was being observed, but very lightly, as a part of the background. It was kind of disconcerting, so I went back to sleep pretty quickly. Aerial recon flew over the next morning and still found nothing. About midday, the team arrived to clear the landside, and the other rangers and I began searching the backcountry. At the end of the second day, we found it. A chunk of the forest had completely burned down. It was tucked into a valley to the northeast, only a few hundred yards away from where I camped the first night, but I missed it then. It was maybe 200 yards across and 300 running down the mountainside. You'd think this would be too large to escape notice, but it took us almost 2 days to find it. Even then, the aerial team missed it altogether. This was a strange fire too. It burned in an almost clean line down the mountain ridge, forming a recognizable rhombus. And normally, forest fires around here aren't intense enough to completely kill off the fully grown pine trees, but this fire had been hot. Everything was scorched. Total mortality. It almost seemed unnatural, but we couldn't find anything in the ashes to explain it. I wondered if I had missed something for a few days after we left, but eventually, after talking with the veteran rangers, I decided it was just one of those things that can't be explained. Apparently, it's not all that uncommon from what they've said. According to them, if you spend enough time in the wilderness, you start to see things seeing you. I didn't know what they meant by that. We didn't have time to talk more, and I haven't seen them much since. A week after that, I found a couple of idiots trying to start a cooking fire at one of the trailheads. I yelled at them probably harsher than I should have. They seemed to genuinely feel bad about it. Apparently they had missed all the signs. I decided to let it go and I began to leave. But before I drove out, I saw the sparking catch of a fire in the rearview mirror. Infuriated, I drove back and got out, but the campers were just as confused as me. The fire pit was completely cold. It looked the same as I had just seen it, empty and unused after making them clean out the twigs and leaves that they had tried to use. Confused, I walked around the entire trailhead but didn't see any sign of a fire. I figured it was a trick of the light in the rearview mirror, and I laughed. I convinced myself over the next couple of months not to worry about the weird fire stuff. and nothing outside of the ordinary happened. Until a few days ago. I was on trail maintenance with another ranger, Lauren. She had been working as a ranger for almost 10 years, so I generally followed her lead. We were about 15 miles into the backcountry, checking on some primitive campsites for backpackers. We were currently at campsite number 3. There's 8 in total, and they form a large U over 90 miles surrounding one of the larger mountains in the region. It was getting into fall, so it was supposed to be empty while we worked our way through, checking up on site quality. All afternoon, I'd been cutting out a new trail from the campsite up to a spring that had changed course recently. The shadows were beginning to grow long, but I was close to finishing, so I kept cutting away. About half an hour later, I broke through and I walked onto a boulder the ground slanted into, and watched the head of the spring just in sight up the mountain. It looked like a deer path meandered its way up the spring head, so I started up. When I got there, I almost threw up. The spring flowed clearly enough, but just to the right of it, a section of the ground turned to weathered stone. In the middle, a skinned deer laid in a pool of blood, with splatters and other pools of blood scattered everywhere in the nearby vicinity. I've seen plenty of dead animals before, but this one was messed up. Something had skinned a deer, and very cleanly, and I couldn't find any other signs of damage. It had bled to death, and God, there was blood everywhere, but its actual hide was nowhere to be seen. Flies were starting to circle the meat. Didn't look like it had been dead for long. I quickly hiked back down the several hundred yards and I cut out and found Lauren, who was back from working and making dinner. I paused to catch my breath and told her that I had to show her something. She looked concerned, so we went back up to the spring. When we got there, the deer was gone, and I couldn't find a drop of blood. I had been gone maybe an hour at the most. It didn't seem possible. Lauren assumed that I was messing with her, so I played it off and I tried to forget about it. But I haven't forgotten about it. And apparently Lauren told my supervisor Jonathan. He asked me to come back to the forest station, so tomorrow I'm driving out of the backcountry. He sounded different though, almost like he didn't really want to call me in. I guess I'll see how it goes and I'll update this when I can. I don't think I should be alive. I met with my supervisor yesterday, and at first it seemed like it really might just be a formality. He didn't say anything about the deer. We made small talk for a while, but finally he broke the safety of our conversation by pausing and saying, "You're probably wondering why I called you back a few days early in this rotation." I nodded slowly and he continued, "Well, we've been really impressed with your performance, and I finally got approval from HQ, so congratulations. You passed your 3-month performance review, and are now a permanent ranger with us." This caught me completely off guard, but I quickly masked my relief and I thanked him. We talked a bit more about the increased responsibility, and he gave me my next assignment with the team. I was feeling pretty good, shook his hand, and I was on my way out. Before I shut the door behind me, he said, "Before you leave, you mentioned you saw some oddly skinned deer out there. Did something scare you?" The blood drained from my face and I thought about telling the truth, but instead muttered something about it being a dumb joke. Jonathan nodded his head thoughtfully, and though he didn't look satisfied with my answer, he did impress me. He just said, "That would be an unusual thing to find," measuring each word out carefully, while looking past me distantly. That felt like the end of our conversation, so I shut the door behind me, walking away as quickly as I could without seeming weird. Something was off, and for some reason, I got the feeling the whole meeting had been about asking that last question. I should have driven out of the mountains and back home after that meeting, but something held me back. On the drive back into the mountains, I got caught up in the beauty of the rising slopes, twisting valleys and graceful, swaying pine trees. My whole life, I've come to the mountains with problems, and ideas that I need to think over, and they somehow make everything simple. In the shadow of these mountains, I've always been able to realize how small my worries are, and I find content. I briefly thought about driving home, but once I got a few miles in, I was never going to go back. I still had work to do here, and by the time I got my assignment location, I wasn't worried at all anymore. I met up with the other rangers at the campsite that they had set up near the trailhead, and found that they had decided to celebrate my pseudo-promotion. At first, I didn't think I was in the mood to party, but the atmosphere was so nice and I had a few beers, and a few hours later, I was pretty drunk. I got to talking with Ryan, another ranger who had been on the job about as long as Lauren, on the tailgate of a truck away from the rest of the team. We were overlooking the valley that ran for miles north, where we would be working for the next few weeks. There are lots of different types of rangers, but I've always found the quiet ones to have the best stories. Ryan was normally one of the quiet rangers, but he chose this time to open up to me. I had been telling him about the rhombus fire from a few months ago, and he was nodding in familiarity at different points in my story. When I mentioned walking off the trail and losing track of time, he looked alert. I laughed it off as a dumb mistake, but he took it seriously. I've heard of losing time like that before, but never so close to the forest station. I've always heard it happening deep in the forest, like 100+ miles out, and you weren't that far. This seemed to disconcert him. He took a sip of his beer. There's more too. I've heard it goes way back to Native Americans even, but they called it wandering. They said that the people who became wanderers first wandered through the woods from camp to camp, never staying anywhere overnight, preferring to keep to caves and hollows throughout the pines. They eventually accomplish what they seek in a way, becoming a part of the wild. They adopt animalistic qualities and disappear from society, reappearing here and there in stories and folktales, separate from time. He shook his head. Those are just old myths, but I do believe there's something off about these woods and I don't know. I wanted to bring up the deer, but I didn't quite know how to broach the subject. Ryan ended up talking about something more interesting, so I kept listening. The thing with the fires is weird though, he said. Don't let yourself be convinced it's not. Those backpackers said they saw multiple bonfires with people around them. So why would they lie about something like that? Ryan had also been there while we had searched through the ashes, and knew that it wasn't really resolved, though it was filed away as a natural wildfire. Whole thing sort of reminds me about this woman that went missing out here maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Some backpacking trek turned around after 40 miles when one of their people got sick. Well, it wasn't until they returned to the trailhead that they realized that they were missing one of their party members. A young woman vanished at some point on the way back, and no one remembered seeing her leave or when she had disappeared. She was gone. Somehow no one noticed. A search and rescue team came in to help look for her, and even they admitted that it was bizarre. We all wondered if foul play might have been involved. How does someone disappear without being noticed over a 4-day return trek? He shrugged and said, "We found her a few weeks later, and not where we expected to. Normally these type of people show back up around trailheads and primitive campsites along the trail after a while. But not this girl. We found her way up in the mountains above the tree line. And honestly, we probably never would have found her on our own. We were only out there looking for anything because someone reported a huge smoke column coming up from behind this peak. We went to check it out and we didn't find any fires, but we did spot a bright red jacket, one exactly like the backpacker said she had been wearing." He leaned in. "Over the next couple days, we brought more people, other search and rescue teams, and eventually found what was left of her." Closing his eyes, he paused for a moment. "Someone had flayed her. Alive it looked like from these scratch marks gouged in the ground around her. She was already rotting, She had been there for a while. She wandered so far too, almost 70 miles from the trail that she went missing on. Sometimes people go in the wrong direction, but 70 miles wrong. Her group was shocked. Police investigated, but it was obvious none of them had any part in it. I sat speechless. It couldn't be a coincidence. The deer was not the first. A family of owls began hooting down in the valley, and we both listened for a moment. That was a long time ago, though. I try not to think about it too often. Suddenly, he looked nervous, like he had said too much. Anyways, I'm pretty tired. I'm gonna go catch some sleep. He patted my back and he walked away. There was no way that I was sleeping now, so I decided to walk down into the valley to clear my head. It was late, but the moon was easily bright enough for me to follow the trail down. I walked maybe half a mile before moving just off the trail to sit on a rock ledge that overlooked a high slope. Watching the stars, the pines swaying gently in the wind, I began to relax. I sat there for a while and closed my eyes, trying to empty my mind. But very gradually, an unnerving feeling began to wash over me. It was very slight at first, like the sense of being observed I felt before the forest fire. But it grew stronger, until I was almost certain that I was being watched by something intelligent. I was still laying on the rock, scared to move and startle whatever this presence was. My science teacher in elementary school told my class about this when I was a kid, but I never actually experienced the feeling myself. He told us about wild cats, apex predators, that stalk their prey so efficiently that you can't see them, but you instinctually know that they're there. Your brain subconsciously observes very small details that on their own are meaningless, but together are unsettling, because they mean one thing. Something is watching you, and you don't know what or why. I remember thinking it was cool at the time, but now it was terrifying. I tried to remain calm while I thought about what to do, but realized I only had one option. I stood up and I started sprinting back to the trail and towards the trailhead. As soon as I hit the trail, I heard a distant thumping of some sort of running gait behind me that sent me up the trail faster, adrenaline allowing me to ignore my lungs, which were beginning to burn. I glanced over my shoulder once and saw some sort of semi-humanoid shaped figure running after me. It looked like it had the skin of a deer, but it seemed to conform to a different contour than that of any animal I've seen. Its back was painfully twisted forward, its skin ragged and pulled down to hooves which it used to move unnaturally quick over the trail. I couldn't see its face in the moonlight, but I could see elegant antlers arching on both sides of its head. I ran harder and I finally saw the campsite ahead. I burst into the clearing and I crashed into something in front of me. A high-pitched, breathless gasp told me it was Lauren. "God, I'm so sorry," I said, getting to my feet and giving her a hand. "There's a..." Her jaw dropped and she pushed past me to look down the trail into the valley. I followed her gaze and looked over my shoulder. A huge wall of fire cut the forest in half, a mile into the valley. The forest was burning. Strange trails have appeared in the backcountry in areas that are supposed to be completely undeveloped. I first noticed one a few days ago, following them when they cropped up here and there, only identifiable by the cleared vegetation and worn topsoil paths. But these aren't normal trails. They loop around, run uphill and distort sense of direction by winding back and forth through steep valleys. I must have explored 20 plus miles of these trails over a couple days, but at times, I go back through an area and it would be different. At first, I thought I was just misremembering, but then I started paying attention. Curves and other points of interest shifted in certain ways. They weren't completely different, just enough for me to notice. Yesterday, I swore a path had run on the other side of the stream that I was going down. And then on my way back, I couldn't even remember which side it had been on to begin with. It was just to my right now. I'm scared to mention this, but I have to. Deer carcasses have become a normal sight around here. I see them almost daily. Sometimes they are there days later rotting away, but sometimes they disappear without a trace. After several days of finding deer carcasses, I had enough and I pulled out of the valleys. The trails were in and I hiked back to the start of the backcountry. I'm not sure if I even want to report these to HQ. I've been on an extended solo trek surveying and monitoring wildlife risk in the remote forest to the north, so I really could just say nothing. And I would probably be the only person to ever find them before they became overgrown again. However, the trails got here. I hadn't seen anyone around to maintain them, so soon enough they'll be impassable and slip back into the wilderness and fade away with time. To quickly address my last post, the forest we were going to work in had some sort of spontaneous combustion event that rapidly lit a huge wildfire across the valley. Our team quickly moved out above the tree line and called it in. Over the next few hours and into the late morning, aerial teams dropped fire suppressant and eventually contained it in the valley. We walked through later that evening when just these smoldering ashes remained. This had almost been an intense, total mortality fire. We never found the cause either. Beyond that, natural circumstances created the perfect conditions for a fire. I didn't mention anything to anyone about the thing that I saw the night before, but I kept an eye out for any charred, disfigured bodies. The other rangers and I were pretty shaken up after the whole ordeal, but our supervisor didn't seem to sympathize. He told us that there had been an unannounced controlled burn, and that due to some clerical error, we got sent out to the wrong place. This seemed totally out of the norm to me, but no one openly questioned him. They gave everyone the next day off, but when we returned, he split everyone up to separate assignments across the forest. I ended up on a solo trek in the north. Other than the trails, it's been a quiet assignment. I wish I could talk to Ryan about the thing that I saw, but I haven't gotten a chance. It almost seemed like he avoided me after the fire. The more I've thought about it, I think whatever I saw out there was the dark tricking my eyes. It doesn't seem that unlikely that some deer got spooked when the fire went off, and ran up the trail and I mistook it for something else in the moonlight as I glanced over my shoulder. But I have become a little paranoid since seeing the deer thing. It validated my concerns from the first fire. Something is out there, and I won't let it scare me away from being here. I'm just more careful, always carrying overnight gear, rations for a few days, plenty of water, and even a rifle. We're not really supposed to carry guns, but if I get in trouble for it, I'll just say it was for bears. Better to look foolhardy than to let them know what it's really for. I guess that brings me to the realization that I don't trust my supervisor at all. I've got a strong gut feeling that something's up with him. I just don't know what yet. I'm not sure how much I trust the other rangers either. They seem to readily accept Jonathan's explanation about the fire that almost killed all of us. If there is some sort of cover-up or conspiracy going on, there's no telling how high up it goes, or who all is involved. Anyone could be in on it and have incentive to keep quiet. I should also tell you, I'm probably going to get pulled from my post in the north in the next couple of days, unless something changes. A young girl went missing yesterday in the southern part of the forest. They've kept it quiet so far, but if they don't find her soon, they're going to pull us all in to help look for her. Normally, they would leave this kind of thing to search and rescue, but I heard from one of the rangers who works closely with Jonathan that some big people in administration aren't happy with another missing person, so we're getting looped into this too. Whatever is going on between the dead deer, bizarre fires, strange trails, and missing girls, it all feels connected. As much as I want to, I know I can't leave now. Whatever is going on, it's messed up, and I won't stop until I get to the bottom of it. I spent all last night downloading low-res satellite and topographic maps of the forest where the girl went missing, since I haven't worked there that much. Whatever people were even doing down there is beyond me. It's a mostly forested and mountainous region, with an incredibly rapid elevation increase of several thousand feet. And I spent a lot of time looking this up because I couldn't believe it. But the area that the girl went missing in is also supposed to be mostly underdeveloped. Besides an old mining outpost that was forcibly closed in the 30s after environmental concerns. The Forest Service is normally pretty lax as far as conservation goes, but from the old news reports I found, this place was responsible for killing off large amounts of game, polluting the entire watershed and spreading horrible illnesses amongst the miners. The search effort isn't coming within miles of this place for whatever reason, but the nature of its closing makes me wonder if there's something more to it. Most of the old mines around here closed during the 60s, after it became apparent that there wasn't an abundant amount of gold in the mountains. None of these mines were very careful about conservation, and like I said, the Forest Service normally doesn't stick their nose in, so how this one closed struck me as odd. Ryan's story about the Native American wanderers got me curious about other folklore from this area, but I haven't been able to find anything. States in the West and really most federal nature preserve do a pretty good job of documenting Native American culture and view it as a responsibility due to their tragic treatment. But I couldn't find much besides a list of a few tribes that may have passed through here in the initial land migration thousands of years ago. I dug a little deeper and stumbled across an old nature-themed internet forum, talking about weird stuff in the woods that mentioned strange trails. This poster was someone homesteading off cheap government land in the mountains, who discovered a huge system of trails. They were all a little larger than Deer Pass and led off the poster's property and through the forest for over 40 miles. These didn't sound like the trails that I had found, but they were similar enough to keep me interested. They specifically mentioned that these weren't documented in any map, so how could such an extensive system of trails remain undiscovered? I wanted to message the poster, but his account was deleted years ago, and this was written back when the internet was all anonymous, so they made sure there weren't any identifying details in his post to lead back to him. The rest of the thread seemed like mostly speculation. One guy asked if there is a sizable deer population, claiming large herds break down into smaller families that sometimes inadvertently create these type of trail systems. The original poster didn't think that this was the case though, and they hadn't found any evidence of recent activity or a large deer population, both of which would be necessary for something this extensive. The same went for the trails I found. Another user suggested that they stay as far away from these trails as possible, saying that they've seen the same thing, and that they are time holes. If you go in, the trails may twist behind you, trapping you in, and no matter how far you wander off the trail, you'll end up back on the same trail. Eventually, a trail will open with a pathway out again, but you may come out at a different place and time than you entered. I'm aware it's the internet, and there's no reason to take anything on here as truth, but this sounded eerily familiar, and the forest is just weird in that way. Trust is often stranger than fiction out here. Stories around the campfire are usually based on some distant truth, sometimes more disturbing. I promise not to tell too many campfire stories, I'm sure you've heard enough, but this one is my personal favorite and my biggest fear. It goes something like this. You're backpacking in the mountains one day, which are notorious for unpredictable weather. High-speed winds, storms, sleet, and rain can form around the peaks without any warning. All backpackers know this if they're even remotely experienced, so everyone always carries gear and equipment to safely survive any type of weather that you might experience. This isn't such a big deal on a day hike, but if you're going on a multiple-day trek, it's essential. Today you're backpacking out on a smaller trail off the main path through the backcountry winding up to the crest of a mountain. You didn't see it marked on the map anywhere, but you were curious and it didn't look too intensive, so you decided to check it out for a few miles. After a while, you spot another backpacker in the distance. He's by himself, coming down the mountain towards you, while you're hiking up. Nothing is alarming at first, but then he gets closer. He's wearing a white balaclava and a green rain jacket, and rain pants covering black hiking boots. You wave at him when he's about 100 yards away, but he doesn't seem to notice. He gets closer and you realize that other than his clothes, he has no gear at all, no backpack, or even a water bottle. He walks by you with his head down, not saying anything, and speeds up once he passes you, almost trotting down the mountain. You briefly wonder if he's camped out somewhere, but you don't remember seeing a tent or supplies anywhere. You walk another mile thinking his camp must be somewhere up ahead, but you find nothing. And then movement catches your eye and you spot him crossing over the hill in front of you, coming down ahead of you again. Suddenly, everything about him feels wrong, and you take off quickly down the trail back to the main path. You see him again an hour later, but this time halfway up the steep valley the trail crosses the top of. He's struggling to climb up the rocky mountainside. You hear him loudly moaning, incoherent noise filling the valley, and call out to him, but he stops making the noise and goes quiet. Unnerved, you get back to the path and hike the rest of the trek faster than ever before, sleeping very little. You don't see him again. When you get back to civilization a few days later, you talk to the local rangers about what you saw on the unmarked trail, but they have no record of any trail existing there, or anyone else who registered to hike that particular backcountry trek, though it was a self-registration system. They tell you they'll send someone to check on it, but you never hear back from them, and that's fine with you. That's pretty much it. There's a lot of variations of that story. Everyone who's been in the wilderness is afraid of meeting the impossible man. He shouldn't be there, but he is. The forest is overflowing with stories like that. Practically half the time rangers spend socializing. We just tell each other stories. In many cases outside the forest, I would be inclined to say that word of mouth is unreliable. But spend some considerable time in the woods and being alone will change your mind. People's experiences and gut feelings are different to nature, rawer. You trust stories because the farther you get into the mountain and forest, the less relevant time and truth become. What exists out there just exists out there, and what you think should or what is supposed to isn't pertinent to the reality. Some of us like stories with conclusive endings, but I've always preferred the more ambiguous ones. Somehow they feel more plausible. Especially lately, I can't make sense of anything. But back to what I do know. There are unusual things going on in the forest, and they're tied together. Hopefully the girl shows up alive soon, but I somehow doubt it. Once I get reassigned down there, I'm going to see if I can sneak away and check out this old mining outpost. It seems like a good start. If you don't receive another update, assume the worst, and stay away from strange trails in the forest. Sorry for the lack of updates. I'll try to explain as much as possible, but I don't have much time to write at the moment. Jonathan and some other upper admin guys are getting to base camp later tonight, and Lauren and I are supposed to show them around, so we can fix whatever we need to for the big day tomorrow. I got called down after a couple of days like I thought I would. The next morning, I left early from the Northern Ranger Station and drove down through the mountains. To save some time, I decided to cut across the plains that sit between the mountains to the north and south. A small 60-mile area of no elevation gain. I drove out from under the shadow of the last valley, and the plains opened before me. The sky cloudy and the southern mountains towering, slightly blue in the distance. Their peaks climbed up higher and higher as far as I could see behind the first slopes. A few hours later, and I was driving back and forth along the valley's edge, only a few miles out from the temporary search camp. Low clouds had moved in shortly after I got into the mountains and blocked out the sun. Minuscule droplets of water drifting to my windshield. I smoked a cigarette and I cruised through the steep section of the road, but let my foot off the gas when I saw something weird up ahead. The road was shimmering, like it would in the heat, but it was overcast and chilly outside. The road almost seemed to just flatten. Gray seeped into the edges of the shadows underneath the pine tree that hung over the road. I got closer and I hit my brights to get a better look. A flock of some dark birds erupted from the branches of the pine tree, coming towards my truck before swooping up into the sky behind me. I tried to look into the mirrors, but I didn't see where they had gone. I turned my head back around and saw a few lone pine needles suspended in the air, drifting down slowly. But the road looked normal again, so I continued warily to the search camp. After a few minutes, I had figured I'd be close enough to listen in on the camp frequency with my small handheld radio, so I checked my notes and I turned the knob. A few crackles and I heard a dispatcher talking to a search team. I propped the radio on the dashboard and I kept driving. Not too long after, I turned down a smaller dirt road that winded down into a valley. After maybe a mile of the snaking road, it opened into a large, primitive site meant for campers. It was still pretty empty, only a half-dozen two-man tents and a large pavilion tent. I pulled into a spot behind another ranger's truck and I got out. I checked in with Lauren, who was in the large open tent talking over the radio to the team. She looked up when I came in and waved at me. I came over and she pointed to the large map that they had laid out and were marking off into individual zones. But that's not what I was helping her with. I was called in before the other search and rescue and ranger teams to help set up the camp for them. I spent the next couple of hours digging another latrine and clearing away some campsites that plants were beginning to reclaim. That night, I sat around a small camp stove with Lauren and we made dinner. I was going to excuse myself to try and sneak away to the mine, but Lauren said something that I wasn't expecting. "I should have believed you about the deer," she said. "I found them too since then, and other things over the years." She looked uncomfortable talking, which was disconcerting coming from someone who had always been confident out here. "Did you tell Jonathan?" I asked, half interrupting her. "Tell him what?" she asked, sounding a little confused. "About the first deer. He mentioned something to me about it that day he promoted me before the fire." "I didn't tell him anything about that," she said. I didn't say anything. I just sat there on my heels staring past her thinking, how had he known? It was impossible. There was no one else out there but Lauren and me. But that wasn't right. Something had gotten to the deer too. There was an unaccounted party. "What have you seen?" I asked after a while. Now she looked away and then over her shoulder. There was no one else in the camp except for me and her, but she stayed crouched next to the camp stove. "Well, I've been working here 11 years now. There's a lot that happens here that they don't tell anyone," she said in a low voice. "Who's they?" I asked. She just looked at me for a moment before continuing slowly. "I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary for my first few years, but after a while, I started to notice things." She brushed her dark hair behind her ear. "I grew up in the Smoky Mountains and I thought I knew how the birds behave in places like this." She pointed around to the hills. Darkness falling over the valleys now that the sun was behind the peaks to the west. "But I've never seen birds act like they do here. It's unsettling. They talk to each other, and before they notice you, they seem mostly normal. And then they see you and they just stare, sort of emptily." She got very silent, each word a whisper. "Right through you. Like they know." She shook her head. "They're intelligent, especially the larger birds of prey. I swear I've seen the same hawk in the northeast for years, and every time I see it, I get the sense that it remembers me and isn't just being territorial. Anyway, I know places change over time, but every now and then, I would go back through an area after a while, and landmarks felt oddly out of place. Not obviously, just twisted, angled off maybe. And of course, there was the search for the woman that went missing 5 years ago. We searched for months," she said quietly. "There was no way she got where they found her by herself. No freaking way. I get the weirdest feeling that there's something out there. She started breaking down the camp stove. I worked on that trail for 4 more days after you left. I saw a deer the next afternoon, and then another on the last day, wrapped around a tree. Its rib cage was messed up. She finished collapsing the stove stand and placed all the components back in their bag, making sure the tank was tightly closed. Now your turn. Not many rangers were so open with me about what they had seen, so I had a good gut feeling to trust her and filled her in on these strange trails that I had also seen, and what I had found out about them. I even told her about the weird deer creature that chased me through the woods before the fire, though I made sure to mention that I couldn't be sure what I had seen. You looked like you had seen a ghost. Maybe you did, she muttered and then shrugged. I don't know what to make of all of this. We aren't the only ones that know about this stuff, but no one talks about it. Last year, some guy made a big deal about an incident between him and another ranger, and he said some weird stuff to me. He was reassigned a couple weeks later, but I heard that he was seeing another ranger, who I know hasn't heard from him since. Just be careful, she said. I bit my cheek and I debated whether to fully trust her or not. There's a place that I think we should check out, I said. Lauren raised her eyebrows. It's an old mine, but I noticed it's not included on these search maps for some reason. It's only a few miles from the trail that she went missing on. A few miles down a steep valley into a gorge, she said. Well, yes, but all the terrain out here is messed up to move through on foot anyways. Just as likely she got there, and besides, this place has a weird history. Her brow was furrowed, and I could tell that she was considering it. Not today, she said. I have to stay on the radio while the 2 search teams get back. But tomorrow, after searches end for the night, we can slip away. I nodded my head, and Lauren patted my shoulder before standing and walking back under the large tent and checking in with the search teams over the radio. That night, I couldn't sleep. The edges of my consciousness were restless and cycling through thoughts. Eventually, I fell asleep and I got a few hours of rest, because the next thing I knew, someone was moving around in the large tent making breakfast. I slipped out of my sleeping bag and got ready. I ate breakfast quickly, and then tagged along with Lauren and a search and rescue unit to climb down into a gully people sometimes fall into and get lost trying to get out of. On the hike to the gully, the search and rescue guys told us things fall in all the time, and it's a 60-foot drop for several miles, so not much comes out. We walked another mile through the pine trees before they started to peter out, and suddenly, we were above the ridgeline, looking over the forest and down a long line of peaks to the northwest. We walked a bit farther and broke off the trail once we had reached a marker a searcher placed earlier. Down a steep rocky hill about 50 yards, and then the gully opened before us, a 60-foot deep and 100-foot wide chasm carved down the mountain. While one of these search and rescue guys started setting up a rope for us to rappel down, I climbed up the hill onto a small outcrop to look over the gully better. It was huge, with a dry stream bed at the bottom. The search and rescue team mentioned it runs intermittently in the spring. I watched for another few minutes, eating a granola bar, not really expecting to see anything. And I didn't for as long as I sat there, until these search and rescue guys started rappelling down one by one. Lauren made me go first, and once they gave me the all clear below, I backed off the ledge and down the vertical rock face. We don't rappel all that often, but I've done it enough to feel comfortable going down, so I made it quickly and got off the rope while Lauren came down. She bounced down smoothly, and we took off the harnesses and began hiking down the gully. The searchers decided to go up the gully where it stayed closer to the trail, so Lauren and I walked southeast in the opposite direction. We found lots of old bones here and there, but nothing that didn't look like an animal you would expect to find, until I found what I swore was the lower portion of a human jaw. I only noticed it because I almost stepped on it. It was faded and smooth. It had been down here a long time. I looked closer and I called Lauren over. We both weren't 100% certain, so we radioed search and rescue. They hiked down to us and agreed that it was a human jaw, but that it was far too old to be who we were looking for. We canvassed the entire surrounding area with search and rescue for another hour, but still couldn't find any other part of that skeleton. The rest of the afternoon, Lauren and I followed the gully until it opened into the valley, and found no sign of the girl or anything else of interest besides the jaw. When we returned to camp after hiking around the long way, they had already bagged it up and sent it off for DNA testing, so hopefully we'll find out who it belonged to, or maybe close the case out here. There were almost 20 of us out there looking that day, with more supposedly coming. After dinner, I met up with Lauren and we told the other guys that we were going to make a supply run for a few extra things, which gave us a little over 4 hours to burn before anything seemed suspicious. Lauren got into her gray pickup, and we headed back out towards the main road. When we made it, we took a right turn, deeper into the mountains instead of back towards the nearest town. The mine was much higher up, about half an hour through these steep roads. 45 minutes later, we were stopped on a ridge looking over the peaks. I had the hasty map I drew out earlier on my knees, trying to figure out if we had missed the turnoff. "Nah, forget it," I said. "Keep going. I think it's up ahead down this next valley." Lauren pulled forward and we kept going for another half mile, away from the ridgeline and into another series of steep, surrounding pine slopes. "Are you sure the road wasn't that spot that I slowed down and asked you, is this the spot, earlier? It looked like it led over the top of that slope and into the right." She stopped at the sight of a rusty metal gate standing amongst tall grasses that were covering the road. Lauren pulled over and we got out to inspect the gate. We couldn't get it to budge. Not that it would have mattered. The road was impassable at this point. I checked the map again. "It's not too far, not even a mile," I said, "and we still have a few hours." "Alright, let's check it out," Lauren said. The sun had set behind the peaks long ago, and now a fog was curling out, so we couldn't see down into the valley. We swung on our day packs and after walking a short way, found a rocky path that led straight back into the cliff face. There I saw the opening of the mine with twisted, rusted machinery laying on the ground surrounding the entrance. It looked like when the place had shut down, everyone dropped their things and left, and no one had been back since. We walked over to the entrance and peered in. A danger keep out sign had been chained to a metal door framed over the entrance, but now it dangled uselessly off its hinges against the left wall. We pulled out our headlamps and put them on. The beams flew back into the mine, spotlighting the dust slowly drifting up from the depths. Lauren pulled out her anemometer, and we began hiking down. "Hello, can anyone hear me?" I called out. My voice echoed emptily down the tunnels. This was a huge mine with several deep shafts, easily hundreds of feet deep. I couldn't find a recent map, besides one that was created in its early days, so after the first few floors, I wasn't sure what to expect. We had no idea what condition this place would be in. We crept through collapsed beams and timber misplaced on the rock floor here and there, and eventually found a way down to the next floor. It was a metal staircase spanning a chasm, drilled into the rock on both sides and supported by some timber below. I picked up the largest rock that I could find and tossed it, and the stairs didn't budge. So, I crept down carefully over the chasm that the stairs had spaced. This layer had a cool draft, so Lauren and I followed it, till a slope led slowly uphill. It was getting kind of sketchy, with beams sagging around indiscernible rock, and then it opened up into a wider room with another shaft running down through the center. Peering in, I couldn't tell how deep it was. This place had gotten deep over the years. None of this was on the map. But then a muffled noise echoed up the tunnel directly ahead, and Lauren and I immediately tracked the direction ahead. This room was some sort of a hub. The vertical shaft was filled with ropes and crates, intersected by beams in different rooms for several floors above. I could faintly see moonlight casting edges of gray lines in the top floor. How long had we been down here? We edged closer and stopped when we heard the noise again. This time we pushed forward and around the corner, cables wrapped tightly on the rocky wall, and found a girl bound and laying on the ground. I could smell blood. She didn't seem to be conscious. It sounded like she was having trouble breathing. I knelt to check her pulse and the noise sounded again. I looked back at Lauren, startled. It wasn't her. It sounded again, and this time closer, and in enough detail for me to notice why it was so strange. Our headlamps are pretty bright, but after 50 feet, they start to dim considerably, and we just see shapes. And farther than that, faint, darker tones, and then nothing. Something was ambling through the darker tones of the shaft away from us. It reminded me of the guttural sound of someone breathing in deeply after coming back to consciousness, but kind of warped in a weird sharp pitch that made it sound like whimpering. I looked back down. This was the girl, and she wasn't that big, so I picked her up and I put her over my shoulder. Lauren was still staring down the tunnel, horrified. The tones were sharpening into a sickening shape that was moving closer. "Lauren, come on," I said, jerking my head towards the way that we came. She looked back at me and twisted her backpack around and pulled out a gun. "Jesus," I said, "what the heck are you gonna do with that?" She just stared at me, and we started back the way that we came as quickly as I could, carrying the girl. Lauren walked backwards carefully over the rocks and timber, never taking her eyes off of the darkness behind us. The sound faded away, and eventually we came to the stairs over the chasm. The stairs were narrow, maybe 1.5 feet, just enough for one person to go at a time, and the lack of railing made me hesitant to carry her across like I was. I set her down and I gestured to Lauren to grab her feet. I grabbed her under the arms and began walking back up the stairs. I finally stepped back and I felt rock under my foot, and took another step as the stairs groaned. The rock beneath me suddenly cracked and dust rose into the air as it plummeted down. I leaned back, still holding onto the girl, and I rolled into the tunnel behind me. The striking of the metal plummeting down the stone chasm was deafening, and it went on forever, reverberating around me. I slowly managed to sit up and crawled over to the edge. The dust in the air drifted away lazily, and I saw Lauren laying on the tunnel below me now. She made it back somehow. The metal staircase was just a faint ringing now, but another strange high pitch was emanating from the tunnel behind Lauren. She looked down horrified, her headlamp swinging around wildly from my perspective. Her light spun towards me and we lit up each other. "I'll find a way around," she said solemnly, and then she walked back into the dark, towards the sound and what was coming. Silence enveloped around me so thick it made me uncomfortable to breathe. I called out to Lauren once in a hushed whisper, but I heard nothing. I couldn't wait any longer. I shouldered the girl again and jogged heavily up the tunnel. I could see moonlight ahead. But then I heard the noise warping ahead of me, blocking the way out. My heart sank. I turned around, and the next thing I could remember, Lauren and I both woke up in a truck outside the road to the mine. There's no sign of the girl. We look like crap and slowly realize where we are, like waking up from a dream, but it must have happened. That's all I have time for. Just know that we both survived and we're okay for now. But things are moving in directions that I didn't expect, and I may not get many more chances to write. I can't say where exactly for my own safety, but just stay away from old places in the woods. Places forgotten.